Welcome back, everybody, to this week's edition of Headlines and Beyond. That's right. Let me take a minute here to turn off my heating system. Yeah, this week's title is going to be Jihadists and American Colonialism. So it's week 2.3 of 2015. This is the edition. And here we go. Well, once again, as I said, my name is Dr. Daniel Karras. You're watching Headlines and Beyond. We're not here to give you the status quo. We're not here so that you can sit back and watch and with your feet up in a neutral position and not think about anything here. Here is where you want to be when you want to know what's going on in the world. If you really want to know what's going on and how to understand the global situation, then this is the broadcast for you. This is the source for you. Now, I say, well, am I going to have to do any reading? Am I going to have to do any homework? And the answer is yes, you are going to have to do reading, and you are going to have to do homework because this helps you understand the situation that's at hand. The two books on the reading list so far are George Orwell's 1984 and Machiavelli's The Prince. These are two fundamental books to understand global politics and geopolitics. And without these, it's a very difficult task to place the events that are going on in the news in geopolitics within a proper historical context. Because everything sits within history. It doesn't sit isolated from history. It sits within and connected to history. So one can go back and take a look at the parallels, make examinations, and then predict from there on out where things might go from, good or bad, where things might go. And this is the analysis. And it's not simply for me to do the analysis, for those who are participating, those who are watching, to also do the analysis to get an understanding for themselves, and then, of course, to spread this idea, the understanding, to other people who are interested, and hopefully make a change in the world for the better. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think journalism is the way, in many ways, in the first step, and is the first step in changing the world, is that it's the information that journalism brings that can do this. The next step after that is, of course, making it aware to other people, making other people understand who may not have the interest or the desire to sit down and watch a very complicated political science journal, a political science journal. And this is what it is. This is a political science journal. This is journalism where it's supposed to be, but this isn't for everybody. This is only for those who really do want to sit down and sort of, go further than what you get in the mainstream media. Of course, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, you're not going to hear about. You're not hearing about American colonialism and that how America has set up colonies all over the world and is using really old world tactics, supporting barbarians, and these are the jihadists, going in order to break up a country, in order to take over its territories and create and set up the colony. These are the puppet regimes. It will fund and finance drug lords. It will fund and finance jihadists and a variety of other militant groups to destabilize the area and then go in under the pretense of protecting the public there and take over. And this is a pretext. This is how you, as an empire, you can expand your empire. But again, you're not there to bring freedom. You're there to bring slavery. You're there to be the ruler of a subjugated people, without necessarily having the people believe that they are subjugated. And this is sort of it's a psychological tactic. And this is where we can talk about Obama's Cold War and Adam Kinzinger, Kinzinger, and his bill HR 758, which was signed into law by Obama, which essentially initiated and put the United States back into a Cold War with Russia. I mean, you have both Gorbachev and Henry Kissinger coming out and saying these are two old Cold Warriors coming out and say this is a mistake. And the thing is that Obama said he was going to be a peacemaker. He was going to be different than everybody else. Yet here he is, plunging the United States and most of the world back into a Cold War with Russia again. He's creating a global conflict. It was also on his watch that you had the Arab Spring, which was not the Arab Spring, it was really a Muslim Spring that destabilized the entire Middle East. I mean, so one could say that you could argue initially, and this is a far-fetched argument, that Obama inherited the situation. But when you have the reality that all he inherited was Iraq and Afghanistan, and after this is when you had the collapse of Pakistan. You had the collapse of the Arab Spring pop up all across the Middle East. You had the Ukrainian situation flare up, where again the United States destabilized the Ukrainian region by overthrowing and committing regime change against an elected government. They did the same thing in Libya. We saw the NATO bombing of Libya. We saw the number of weapons dropped into Libya, and with the expectation that these weapons weren't going to go anywhere, that they're simply going to be used. But we found out that later on that somehow they ended up in the hands of the Jihadists. I mean, who's kidding who? We know how they got into the hands of the Jihadists. The Americans put them there. You know, same thing in Syria, right? You have the United States. You have Senator John McCain on CNN's Anderson Cooper coming up and saying, "Oh, we need to support the American Syrian the Syrian freedom fighters. We need to support the Syrian Free Army." And no one knew who the Syrian Free Army was. No one knew who they were, except when they went in and actually looked at the videos being put out by these people. You could tell that they were jihadists. And then all of a sudden you see after that, you know, after they dump in all this weaponry, here comes ISIS. And all of a sudden there's now Al-Qaeda and ISIS and a whole bunch of other jihadist groups inside of Syria, where they weren't any before. This was the same setup for Iraq. First, there was they were saying, oh, that there is jihadists in Iraq. When we went in, there was no jihadists in Iraq, but as Iraq was destabilized, there became jihadists in Iraq. And in other words, this is the narrative that has gone on globally. And the United States, where its interest in these areas are colonialists. You have governments being set up that are essentially puppet governments to the West, and particularly to America. And so what happens is we can start seeing, if we identify who the jihadists are, understanding that there are two fundamental forms of Islam. There's Shia, and there's Sunni. Understanding that Shia is Iran and Sunni is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is also the United Arab Emirates. They are Qatar. That's Al Jazeera, if you want to know. Al Jazeera is a Qatari operation. There's United Arab Emirates. There's Kuwait. All the caliphates, all the ones supported by the United States, these kings who are supported by the United States, instead of having democracies in there. These are all the Sunnis. These are all, in many cases, these are the jihadists. Well, how do I know this? You go in, you look at who are the Sunnis, and you understand that they're Iranians. So you go in and say, okay, who are the Shia? They are the Iranians. Go in and ask yourself, who are the Sunnis? Okay, you find out that they are the Saudis, that they are the American-supported Islam. In other words, the United States does not support Islam from Iran. The United States supports Islam from Saudi Arabia. So, you go do a study to find out where you see all these attacks coming from, where you see these so-called terrorist bombings. And this is where you see them in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, and Turkey. We see in all these places you see major problems, and you go do a brief demographic report and ask the question: who is the major religion there? In Indonesia, it's Sunni, right? Malaysia, it's Sunni. Thailand, it's Sunni. Bosnia, it's Sunni. Kosovo and Albania, Sunni. Turkey, Sunni. In other words, these are the jihadists, and the Sunnis, as we know, are Arab supported. They're also supported by the United States, and functionally also by Israel. So we see now that there is an American hidden hand here, and this is what we're talking about. Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda is also Sunni as well. So same thing with ISIS, and we see that the United States does indeed fund these groups. And of course, they don't do anything without the approval and knowledge of Israel. And this is, if you understand, look at the functioning of AIPAC, which does not represent the Israeli populace. It represents Israeli policy in the United States. AIPAC is not there to represent the average Israeli citizen. They're there to represent and push Israeli policy. And we need to be clear when we're talking about Israel and Israeli action. We're talking about Israeli policy. We're talking about the nation as a foreign policy standpoint. We're not talking about the individual people. And this sort of needs to be clear here that this is what we are talking about. And we see that this hand exists all over the place, and in all these places, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, and Turkey, there's oil. There are natural resources. So there, we can start seeing these things. And then we just start looking at, what some of the reports are coming out. December 27th, we have reports out of Thailand. Thailand, you have in the south there, you have the Sunnis, the jihadists trying to create a separate homeland state for the Thai Muslims. They want to create another Islamic state. And since 2004, the calculus is there's more than 6,000 people dead. And there are continuous continuous attack of bombing. And this echoes. This is December 27th. This echoes what we saw in the Sydney Cafe attack, which was not reported correctly. The person was indeed was indeed a Muslim from Iran. He was initially Shia, but at the time of the attack, he had converted from Shia to Sunni. In other words, he had gone from being a Persian Muslim to an Arab Muslim. And the thing is this is what we saw here. But the whole thing, if it had to be found outside the United States, was not found in the United States. I found this information in Indian and Bangladeshi papers. Then on December 22nd, we have the driver running down crowds of people in France. Again, he was a jihadist. They say he was the lone wolf attack again, but they neglect to say that there were two other people in the car with him. These two other people in the car with him disappear. If you know clandestine operation, you know black op operations, then you know that the people who disappear like that, who are not mentioned in the news, they're not arrested, these are indeed operatives. They're military operatives. And they're protected by they're part of the Francis side. They're French intelligence, they're British intelligence, they're American intelligence, they're Israeli intelligence. And you're going to begin to understand that you have an intelligence operation going on, not a terrorist attack, and that you have intelligence operatives from the West behind these actual events. So when we come to the attacks in the new year on the French paper that had sort of reportedly posted pictures of cartoons of Muhammad in a cartoon in a sort of a satirical manner. And we look at what had gone on just recently this week in France, in Paris. When I ask yourself, well, who was behind it? And it said, I'm just going to hear now. It's the Charlie Hebdo shooting. Actually, that's what they're calling it now. We ask ourselves, well, who is behind this? And of course, what happens? The Al-Qaeda Sunnis, the Arab group, these are Sunnis again, supported by the United States and Israel, who said now they're called Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Remember the Arab Spring now, and the support for Arab Spring that Obama had talked about. And all of a sudden you have these groups popping up saying that they were responsible for this. Now, what was in the headline? You have to ask yourself, what was in the headlines before the attacks in Paris? What was in the attacks, if you go back to October, November, prior to these attacks, what was in the headlines was that France and Europe had begun to recognize Palestine as an independent state. That was in the headlines. This replaced that headline. When we come back on the other side, we'll show you how this attack on on France removed the headline "Free Palestine" in support for a Palestinian state, and replaced it with now this whole issue of terror, and that the issue of the Palestinian Free State is now off the table.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Welcome back to the other side of our break. As we were talking about before, we're talking about the attack in France, now being claimed by Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Not forgetting here and identifying that the Al-Qaeda in Yemen are Sunnis, that they are an Arab-supported group, and that this Arab group is actually funded by the United States and Israel. They are not Hezbollah. Hezbollah, which is on the terrorist list, and is Iranian. You notice that you don't have any Shia groups involved in these attacks. They're all Sunni groups. They're all Arab groups. They're all connected to Qatar. They're all connected to Al Jazeera. They're all connected to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and so on and so forth. And also in the background, because the people supplying them with the weapons are the United States and Israel. So you would expect that when you see this attacks, you will expect to see an Israeli benefit, something that will benefit Israel. And if you look at the news headlines in France and in Europe, and even indeed for the UN in October and November, they were talking about recognizing a Palestinian state. This is where the headline, this is where things were going geopolitically. Since then, since the attacks in December, and since the attacks of recent days, the whole Palestinian issue has been pushed off the table. There is no longer a tentative vote in the UN for a free Palestinian state. There's no vote in the UN to recognize Palestine. All that's been pushed aside, and now the whole focus is on terrorism and national security. In other words, this attack, which was done by an Israeli-supported group, derailed the entire Palestinian discussion. There is your motive. And we know Israel has done this time and time again. Israel is notorious for using its Mossad to achieve the ends and goals that it wants and sees as important. And it doesn't matter who is in the way or who gets hurt. It's the Israeli position that is the most important here. This is the same thing that is true for when we're talking about the events of World War II. The events of World War II are 88 million people died. They don't matter. It's only the 6 million Jews who don't matter. And that's why you have the Jewish Holocaust. You have 88 million people dead in World War II. And the people who matter the most are the 6 million Jews dead in Auschwitz and all the different concentration camps. This is where the importance lies. This is what we see in the media. And this is the narrative that is fed to the general public. When you want to see beyond this, and this is what I'm saying here, is that if it doesn't matter who was killed. It doesn't say there was only one Jew killed in the concentration camps. That doesn't matter. No one should be killed. No one should be put in these concentration camps. If you're working towards peace, then no one should be put in these situations. It doesn't matter who they are, or what background they are, what ethnicity they are. That doesn't matter. It matters that they're human, that you're doing this to human beings. And for people who are wondering about wondering about animal rights and animal abuse, well, what do you expect when people are so inhumane to each other? Do you expect the animal rights situation to get better? I mean, these are sort of some of the questions you need to ask yourself. Well, if you want to solve animal abuse, you want to resolve the issue of animal rights, then you have to resolve the issue of the inhumanity of man to man. And the thing is, we need to stop, in many cases, labeling it. It's not a Jewish Holocaust. It's a Holocaust. People died in there. They weren't Jews. They were people. Understanding this, then we can understand that the situation in Yemen was a horrible. In Paris was a horrible situation because people died. But we can also look at it and see that you have groups of people out there, groups of military people, doing a calculus and saying, well, if a certain number of people die, it's okay because the cause is worth it. In other words, for them, if the number of people who died in Paris are worth it, the number of people who died in 9/11 are worth it, the number of people who died at the Boston bombings are worth it, simply because the end political result, the strategy, the gain, was considered to be more significant than the loss. And this is how they do that calculus there. And as I said, we see this even in Ferguson, right? We look at the Ferguson issue. You have this whole black-white narrative, completely, and that's what we see in the blogosphere. And this is sort of what's going to be coming up next in terms of our next reports. We're going to be adding in a commentary section into separate videos for headline iNN. Why? Because there are sections of the blogosphere. This is the internet, the news on the internet, that needs to be answered. It needs to be looked at. It needs to be analyzed, because it's now part of the question. And what I'm seeing in the blogosphere is they're not talking about police abuse. They're talking about a black-white racial issue. And we go to the Young Turks. This is a new, supposedly left-wing internet news channel, and they brand themselves as cutting edge, as non-mainstream. They try to sort of shape themselves or make themselves into this particular view. But the problem is, they get reading their narratives, they follow the standard lines, and of course you can't take their videos and replay them because they're copywritten. This so-called alternative brand of media says you can't use their stuff to analyze them. You can't be critical of them in terms of showing videos or showing pictures or whatever, because as soon as you do that, you get copywritten and your videos are taken down. There is an enormous amount of censorship under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and it's not as bad on YouTube, but it's also bad elsewhere as well. If you understand what's going on here, particularly with Ferguson, go back to the university experiment in Stanford from Dr. Philip Zimbardo. You can see that when people are given authority, blanket authority, just the way the police are, that abuse is going to occur. And you do. I did just a very minor search on police abuse, and I found tons of video. Matter of fact, there's going to be a documentary in the next 2 weeks coming the way about police abuse. And I think when we tie police abuse, you do that search on police abuse, what comes up? You come up with a TSA. And the thing is, we see, do we understand the TSA, what's going on with the TSA in Border Patrol? And I said, yes, we do. And there's an experiment called the Stanley Milgram experiment. And the Stanley Milgram experiment was an experiment designed to see how far an authority figure can push a low-level personnel into really degrading a human being. And this is borderline torture. And it was set up that you had two people. One person was answering the questions, and one person was giving the questions. The low-level employee of the authority figure was giving the questions. the person answering the questions was attached to an electric machine. For every wrong answer he gave or incorrect that the low level employee thought was wrong, he'd receive an electric shock. The goal was to see how far the employee, when he was told, will push the electrical knob. How far would he put the switch? And there was actually a lethal amount on there. And they pushed that lever almost up to the lethal amount. And there were people in there who had heart conditions, and they were warned about the heart conditions. But the authority figure that was over the employee following the orders, even though they initially objected to it, ultimately listened to the authority figure. And this is what we're seeing in the TSA here. And this I'm saying, I'm comparing the TSA to the Nazis, because why? The whole experiment, the Stanley Milgram experiment, was to see whether or not what the Nazis did were able, in terms of taking ordinary people and getting them to do inhumane things, like torture, whether or not the order from above was sufficient to do this. And they found out this was. That a Nazi, an authority figure, could take an ordinary person off the streets, put them in the prison situation, and then start turning up the pressure and start saying, beat this person up, rape this person, push the torture level. And this is what we saw in Abu Ghraib. This is what we saw in the CIA torture report. We see the sort of called the slippery slope, where once you start allowing the tortures and abuses, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. In other words, we talk about the slippery slope here. And this is particularly why we see some of the backlash that we see in society. Why do we have the lone wolf syndrome? Why do we have these people going nuts up there and doing what they're doing? Because they have this as the excuse. We are being abused by the authority. We are now living in a Nazi state. The United States, if you look at the history of the United States, what's going on in the United States, sort of these border patrols, who aren't actually patrolling the borders, patrolling the border between states and asking for immigration papers between the states. Checking and search, called search and seizure, which is a violation of the Constitution. We see this going on in the name of national security. We also see what's going on. We see that the TSA are molesting people, that they are molesting children in full view of the public, and the police cannot and will not do anything to protect the public because of the orders. But let's go back to now, and this is where history is important, let's go back to the Cold War. This was not our response in the Cold War to the Soviet Union. Our response to the Cold War in the Soviet Union was this: be as free as you possibly can be. Let the freedom of the individual be the weapon against the tyranny of the Soviet Union. And when agents came over from the Soviet Union and saw this, it was easy to get the agent to defect. As a matter of fact, this was the major problem. Anytime the Soviets sent somebody over, whether it was an Olympic team or whatever, they had a huge problem because they always ended up defecting to the United States. Even when they sent agents over, the agents ended up defecting to the United States because they didn't want to go back to the repression of the Soviet Union. And the opening of the door to China by Reagan and Nixon, and this is if you want to be a real follower of Reagan, a real follower of Nixon, was not economic sanctions, but rather economic openness. They opened the borders between China and the United States. They opened trade between China and the United States. It was economic freedom that ended the Soviet Union. It was economic freedom that opened the doors and changed China from what it was. Yet this narrative is completely lost today. It's not being brought up by any Republican at all. What we're seeing being brought up by Republicans today is a Nazi standby. We're seeing a National Socialist argument being brought up and saying, we need to repress people because we need to protect our national security. And if you go back into the Cold War with the Soviet Union, you see this was not the case. Matter of fact, what we're doing here is we're doing the exact opposite what we did to win the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We were doing the exact opposite to fight against tyranny and oppression. We are creating tyranny and oppression in the United States. And I think this is a sort of a warning to the world, because the United States was considered and is considered to be the freest nation in the world. The Americans had the most rights, the most freedoms of anywhere in the world. This is why people came to the United States, was to experience these things, to have these freedoms, not to have them taken away. And here we have an argument again, and this is why, look, who benefited from this? Israel benefited from 9/11. They argue, well, we need to have these border protections. We need to have these protections because we had 9/11. We had the Boston bombing. We had the underwear bomb. We had the shoe bomber. But they neglect to tell you that all these people, the shoe bomber, 9/11, Boston bombers, all of them were actively under surveillance by the FBI. There were prior warnings. The security measures in place today did nothing to stop what actually happened. And they wouldn't have stopped because there were prior warnings. The warnings were simply ignored. Anyways, when we come back, the psychology of evil, we'll continue on with our second half of our program, where we talk more about the psychology of evil. We'll see how this evolves into rape and war and sex slaves. All right, on the other side.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
On the other side of our break, we were talking about how we have given up our freedom, that we're creating a situation of war. We're creating a situation, excuse me, in society where human degradation becomes normal. Excuse me. And this human degradation includes rape and war, and sex abuse through sexual slavery. And we want to try to see, and this is what we looked at before, we look at the psychology of evil through the point of view of psychologists, and these are basically atheists. We see the research that's done from Philip Zimbardo's Stanford University experiment. We see this also in the Stanley Milgram experiment in New York City. And we see that the evil comes out of it. They have actually recognized that the evil comes out of this. And they argue for morality, but they actually don't go into specifics of morality that they need to. Morality can be observed. There is a way to observe morality and to understand what morality is right and what morality is wrong. And what I'm pointing out here, and this is where our exploration is going, is that you need to understand that morality expands from theology. It sits within theology. It is a definition of God, that's theology, that determines what a morality is. And this is where our ethics and law often come from. And this is the case where we looked at the Talmud, which emerges from the Torah. Torah is the Bible, the Jewish version of the Bible. And the Talmud is the legal interpretation. It is the judicial interpretation, the rabbinical texts that emerge from the Torah. I wanted to find an equivalent in Islam because the Quran is actually an extension of the Bible. It is just the way there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, basically the Quran is the Third Testament because it comes well after the New Testament was written. So basically you have the Old Testament written, then you have the New Testament written, and then you have the Quran written. The Quran was considered to be narrated by God to Muhammad, and Muhammad dutifully wrote it down and passed it on. So the Quran cannot be viewed in the same light as the Talmud. The Talmud is the legal, the rabbinical texts. Well, Quran is not a rabbinical text. It is the equivalent of the Torah. It's the addition to the Torah. And the Muslims talk about this. The research that I got from these on the Quran and also on the Talmud were from correspondingly both rabbinical and Islamic sites. I did not go to an interpretation of. I went to these sites specifically and read through the text. I'm still reading through the text. There's an enormous amount there to read through. In the Talmud, we saw how the line from the scriptures was taken, and this was written by a Judaic scholar. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. And they pointed back to Leviticus in this. And Leviticus is the origin of the kosher laws. The Talmud takes the kosher laws that were in the Torah and interprets them for a judicial understanding and creates the rabbinical texts that become and expand from the Talmud. And what ends up happening here is that you end up with a description of not only child sex abuse, but you also, in terms of its permissibility, that it is permissible, but you also, ironically enough, end up with a permission for bestiality, because the child is neither man or woman, and the beast is neither man or woman. This is sort of where the argument comes in. This is how the argument evolves. The Old Testament prohibits a man lying with a man, but notice the Old Testament does not prohibit a man lying with a boy. And this was in a argument to say that the Talmud allowing or permitting sexual abuse was patently absurd. And the more the person wrote and the more he commented from the Talmud, the more he sort of basically dug himself in. And this is something that can be seen actually if you look into the Israeli structure of society, particularly with the Orthodox Jewry, to see how much sexual abuse there is in Israeli society and Jewish society. You'll find there's a significant amount, and the reports are not coming from Aryan Nation websites, are not coming from Aryan Nation groups. And you gotta be careful. There are a lot of Aryan Nation sites that will point out some of these things, but they won't go into the detail that a good Israeli source will actually have. Matter of fact, if you want to really find out what's going on, you look at an Israeli source. If you want to find out what's going on in the Muslim world, you look at an Islamic site and go from there. That's the way of taking. That's the approach I've taken here. And I found an Israeli site that looks at and is advocating. It sort of helps Jewish victims of sexual abuse, and the number of rabbis that are on the pedophile list is absolutely amazing. And the thing is that in many cases, these rabbis are exempt from the laws. The police know what's going on, the courts know what's going on, the politicians know what's going on, but they've just sort of taken a hands-off approach to these people because they have a significant degree of political power. And I said, well, they say, well, how? That's not true. People in high places, they're not, and with a lot of money, they are not immune from the law. Well, all you have to do is take a look at Michael Jackson. Understand that when he was on trial, that the pictures brought out of his special room not only included pictures of boys, but included pictures of babies. And the whole issue of pedestrian sex with children which is in the Talmud here, mentions children as young as 3 years old. And when you see this, you begin to understand that the sexual abuse that Michael Jackson was involved in was a period of time when he was involved with Rabbi Shmuley Batayik. In other words, he was with a Talmudic Jew as his mentor, as his spiritual leader, and under the spiritual leader, this is when these sexual abuses occurred. Understanding what we read, and that there is a site, and I will eventually put this in the description down below, that talks about, and it's an Israeli site, talks about sexual abuse with children within the Israeli Orthodox community. You can now begin to connect these things and understand, hey, there's a significant problem here. But as I said, I don't want to limit this discussion simply to Israelis. I want to look at all of the different theological backgrounds that allow for abuses. They have these sort of so-called loopholes that allow a person to commit moral offenses, horrible offenses, and yet get out of them. In other words, there is a sort of a tacit or a backdoor saying, well, yeah, he did what he did, but it really doesn't matter, and they passed it off. And that's what you see in the Talmud here. It's sort of a passing off of the whole thing. Islam, it took me a while to go through the different documents, and I did find some of this, we call the statutes of Mutta. And Mutta is the temporary marriage that is allowed within Islam. And this includes, I will be posting a video at some point in time on this, and it shows a 11-year-old girl who was under a Mutta contract to she is 11-year-old girl. She was under a contract to a 40-year-old man, and she's talking about her cousins who are 14-year-olds who literally sometimes a lot of these girls, these child brides, live such a horrible lives with these men. They end up setting themselves on fire. They can end up killing themselves. This girl ends up dead. She does end up being killed by her husband. And the mother was all for it. This was, she was not sent in by her father. She was sent in by her mother. And the thing is that when you start seeing this, you start seeing what's going on in India. Again, we look at India as an example of a pluralistic society where you are allowed to do what you're able to do. And you see that sort of these honor killings within these groups, these sort of the Muslim honor killings. They go on a daily basis in India. There are daily occurrences. So I would say it's a normal thing. And they have a whole section here on coitus interruptus. And believe it or not, this is the title of the document here, the title of the site here, coitus interruptus. And the thing is, it is permissible to perform coitus interruptus even if it is not mentioned as a condition of the contract. No, marriage is contract, right? Al-Shahid, Al-Awa, and Al-Tabata claim a consensus of Ummah on this point. In other words, they're talking about different documents that different sort of say, okay, this census derives from a hadith reported from the Amir, the Imam Jafar, that semen belongs to the man and he may expand it as he wishes, right? In addition, in contrast to the permanent marriage, the basic aim of mutta is enjoyment and not the production of offspring. In other words, the whole concept of mutta is prostitution. It is sexual enjoyment. The whole point, the thing is, what they're doing now is because Islam says you have to be married, this is the way around it. This is what I'm talking about, theological loopholes. Does your morality have a loophole around things that says that claims to be wrong? And here it is, right here. And just so we had it in the Talmud. Here is the Islamic version of Talmud. These are the Imam is the rabbinical equivalent. So the rabbinical equivalent in Islam is the imam. And the imams are considered to be infallible, and what they say goes. And this is how you can actually, if you listen to this whole thing about Mutta, that this is how ISIS is raping women in Syria and Iraq. This is how they have their prostitution stables in there. And the thing is, it's all perfectly legitimate within Islam. And there it is right here. And here it goes further. If the woman becomes pregnant such that the pregnancy derives from the period of mutta, the child belongs to the husband, even if he performed coitus interruptus. This statute applies to every legitimate act of sexual intercourse, not specifically to mutta. So they have beyond that, right? Since the principle emancipated in the saying here, the child belongs to the bed of the child belongs to the bed is of general application. Then I can't. There's a Sheikh Al Hassan claims the consensus on this point. It says, however, if the man should deny the child, then it is not then it does not belong to him. In other words, all the man has to say, well, not mine, and he can walk away from this. And here it is again pointed out. They point out that the bed of mutta is like the bed of a slave girl. It does not hold the same high position as the bed of a permanent wife. And here it is. Since a wife by mutta is a rented woman, on this point, it's just a wife of. In other words, they're talking about prostitution here. It's right within. This is right within the Islamic text, the judicial text, the rabbinical text of Islam here. And the thing is, I said, this is what we're looking for. If the abuses are in the system here, there'll be no way to argue around it. They'll be here in black and white, and here we are. This was this was from an Islamic document on this. This was from an Islamic legal text on this. This is why they call it the statutes of mutta. Basically, these are the statutes of prostitution, legitimate prostitution within Islam. And we see the abuses in it. We see the loophole for abuses. When we come back, we're now going to apply this and see how it extends out further and where it ends up when you bring it into modern society, how it ends up destroying entire civilization and destroying, it ends up being attacked and attached to children. Anyways, on the other side.
iNN, uncut, unedited, and real. We deal with issues that other networks won't.
Well, as you can see, we're back. And we're going to tie this to our discussion that we're trying to keep in the news. We try to keep in every broadcast until we can start bringing a resolution to this. And this has to do with sex abuse and rape and war. In particular, now we're talking about sex professionals. These are the women who are so-called prostitutes. I don't like to use the term prostitutes because in many cases, if you sit down and look at the background of the woman as a prostitute, they're not there by choice, they're there by circumstance. There is a difference when you constantly have the option to become a prostitute or not, and one where you do not have the option of not becoming a prostitute. And in most cases, I would say most, if not all cases, the prostitute does not make the choice to become a prostitute. This is not something she chooses to do. There are no other choices. This is the only choice that's presented to her. And of course, she's doing the best to survive in this. We see the alcoholism, we see the alcohol abuse, we see the drug abuse, we see the drug addiction. If we see this, we see the pain of the person, we see the degradation of the person, we see the depth to which this person has been destroyed. When we see that, and we say that this is a moral condition, and we see that we have groups like within the Talmud and Islam now, that there are permissions that allow for this level of abuse. This is the mutta in Islam. This is the bestiality in the Talmud. Because understand that a prostitute is not kosher. And anything that's not kosher is goyim. And goyim is not human. They're beasts. This is the rabbinical view. Understanding this, it would be very dangerous to say that prostitution should be legal, because you would be legalizing the victimization of the women. If you understand the women are victims and you legalize prostitution, then there's no way you can actually help the person, because you cannot get them out of the situation that they're in. You cannot differentiate. And the thing is, you cannot differentiate between the person who's there by force and the person who is there by will. As long as they're kept drugged up, as long as they're kept knocked out, then the person, you cannot have the police go in. You can't have them raid a place. You can't have them go looking for slaves. This has been shown in the areas that are more sexually tolerant. Go to Calcutta. Go to Thailand. Go to any of the Scandinavian countries, and you will find child sex prostitutes. You will find child sex slaves. And you will also find, by the reports by trafficked women, there's the groups who help traffic women, that the highest rates of trafficked women are to these sexually tolerant areas. That sexual slavery increases with the legalization of prostitution, because there is no mechanism. There is no mechanism now to go and prosecute the people who are holding these people, who are doing the slave trading. You cannot go and charge a slave trader if prostitution is legal, because the person's not doing anything illegal. And the thing is, when you see that this is saying, wow, we have to educate children from the age of 6 years old on what's going on here after you've created the condition. And you see now that these are the liberals, the socialists, who have no morals whatsoever. But when you go back and ask yourself, well, what are the Catholics doing about this? Because in Ontario is the standard for much of the United States. If you're an American watching this, pay attention to what's going on in Ontario, because what's going on in Ontario with the liberals, with the socialism, is coming your way. They are going to be sexualizing children from the age of 6 years old and up. Why? Because that's what's done in Sweden. Sweden is the socialist model for the world. Ontario is a socialist model from the United States. This is where Obama gets his stuff from. Want to see where Obama and the Democrats test their leftist views? Come to Ontario. This is where it's being tested out. When you see it being tested out here, watch for it to come to the United States. And what's coming to the United States is sexualization. It is the bringing of pedophilia from Europe, which is all right in Europe. You can have 16-year-olds in porn. It is legal to have a 16-year-old in pornography in Europe. It is legal to a certain extent. It's not illegal. Let's put it the way. It's not illegal to have a 6-year-old in pornography in Europe. In other words, you can produce pornography in Europe with a 6-year-old, but it's not necessarily going to be charged. Not necessarily going to be charged with it. There's not legal in terms of saying, well, they say go ahead and do it, but at the same time, if you produce it, no one's going to bother. You're not going to be prosecuted. You're not going to be put in jail, and most people won't really give a second thought about it. They say, oh, it's just sex. Yeah, just sex with a 6-year-old. She was asking for it. She was sort of coming on to you. She's giving you hugs and stuff like that. She was coming. She was asking for it. That was her form of consent, giving you a hug. As you know, this. The 6-year-olds are very sexual, as you know. This is their argument. So we come to the disagreements from political opposition. This is the Parents as First Educators. And the head here is Teresa Perry, and she's a PhD, educational PhD. And I'll leave everything's in the down below. And she's not talking about pedophilia. She's not talking about the history of pedophilia. She's not calling the premier and her supporters pedophiles, which they are. She's not talking about what has gone on in Sweden and what was permissible in Europe in terms of child prostitution, child pornography, and pedophilia. She has not brought out what this is in terms of child prostitution, in terms of pedestry, sex with children, what's brought out in the Talmud. She does not bring up or anything about mutta within the Islamic community. Why? Read into her background, go to find out who she is. You find out she's a Catholic. And then that dawns on you what's going on right here. Look at the Catholic record on child sex abuse. And you will understand why the Catholic Church has not stood up and come forward on this. They can't. They're as guilty of this as everybody else is. This is the same thing with the Talmud, for the Israelis, for the Jews, as it is for the Islamics, with the Muslims with mutta. They're all guilty of this. They've all got loopholes in their systems that permit this. Don't forget, the Pope is infallible, right? He's the vicar of Christ. He's Christ on earth. And if the Christ on earth doesn't say it's wrong, then, well, it's not wrong. And of course, there's been no admission from the Catholic Church of that what was done was wrong. Matter of fact, they spent decades trying to hide it, decades trying to cover over it and sort of pretend that it wasn't there, even though they knew it was there. And so this is where it leaves us here. Why not? If somebody is a pedophile and is promoting sexual children, why not call them a pedophile? Why not come out and actually state this? I recently got an email from the Parents as First Educators, the PATH group, and ironically enough, they hadn't put out anything since December 16th. But I got something just about a week ago. I think it was a little after New Year's, asking for money. And nowhere in the recent reports, nowhere in the papers, do we see any comparison, even in the mainstream media, of what's going on in Ontario to what happened to the sexual positions, the pedophilia that goes on in Sweden and in Europe as a standard. Look, if you're sexually open, you say, okay, this is fine, then you're a pedophile. Don't be offended when we say that when it's said that Europeans are pedophiles. If you're sexualizing children from the age of 6 years old and up, and if it's not illegal to produce pornography with a 6-year-old, don't complain when someone calls you a pedophile, because that's what you are. When it's not a problem to have sex with a 6-year-old, because it's just sex, don't complain when someone calls you a pedophile, because you are. But yet, none of this comes out in the mainstream media. None of this is presented. And when you talk to the teachers who are supposedly Christian, and I say supposedly Christian, they shrug their shoulders and say, what can I do? Well, the thing is, if you look at the census, most of the teachers in the school system in North America are Christians by registration. Let's see. When the teachers aren't being paid properly, they just say they missed a payment or something like that, we see the strikes, we see wildcat walkouts, we see work to rule, you see lots of action. But when a child is being threatened here with sexuality, being threatened with being raped, what can we do? What can we do? Well, maybe go on strike. Maybe work to rule. How about that? And when they don't do that, their silence is compliance. And then therefore, they are pedophiles. So I have no problem calling the teachers of Ontario pedophiles. Because they have not, none of them have stood up and said anything. They have not organized. They have not organized a wildcat strike. They have not done work to rule. They have done nothing. This is not okay. And we see, this is exactly what we see in the Stanley Milgram experiment. We see that when a person is under some degree of authority, that they have a, someone with authority over, they pass the responsibility of morality onto that authority figure. So the government tells them, and the union tells them, do this, they do it. Dutifully. The government tells them, rape a child, not a problem. And the thing is, of course, when the government tells them, and the unions tell them, well, you're not getting enough money, go on strike, they'll do that too. I mean, they're not making enough money. The teachers are poor. Oh, they're making only making $120,000 a year. And they work, they get 2-3 months off in the summertime. They get Christmas off. They get a lot more time off than most private employees do. And oh God, teachers are having such a horrible life. We can barely afford the lowest level of car. We were basically going to school on bikes because we can't afford anything. The teachers are so poor. Bullshit. And nothing to protect the children. They do all this hoopla and dance and song for bullying, anti-bullying. Every kid I've talked to who's been bullied, even today, they've told the teachers, they've told parents, and nothing's changed. I'm sorry, but teachers are fundamentally bullshit. And that's what's going to come up next. As I said, we'll talk about this in the beginning. We'll bring out and examine what's happening and why it's happening. The next step is to start bringing out solutions and not simply sitting back and simply discussing things. Discussion is good to a point. Once you understand and have an understanding of what's wrong, the next step is to stand up and begin correcting it, to make an effort to correct the problem. And that's where we're going to be going starting next week. And you will see again in this week coming up, you will see commentaries in which we will begin to start taking steps to correct some of the problems that are going on in this world. Anyways, I hope you enjoy. Well, I hope this episode informed you. I hope you do your reading. That is Machiavelli's The Prince and George Orwell's 1984. In the posts and comments, there will be these links to these different things. The MPP who is supposed to be opposing the sexual education program, but he's sort of supporting it, is Garfield Dunlop, MPP, and his information is down below. The conservative MPP, but he's not using who opposes, but he's not using strong enough language, is Monty McNaughton. Give him a call and tell him, hey, look, if these people are pedophiles, call them pedophiles. And this should be of interest to Americans. Americans, call in. If you're a Republican and this is abhorrent to you, call in. Tell them, hey, we're watching south of the border because we see this is coming our way. Anyways, that's it for this edition of iNN's Headlines and Beyond. I will see you next week for the next edition. All right, take it easy and goodbye.
Welcome to the library, and I am the librarian. I am the professor. And professor of what? Professor of physics.
Oh, say, can you see
at Democratic Earth.